Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, both here in the room in St. Gallen, but also online since this session is being streamed to the public. My name is Rolf Wüstenhagen. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to this session on energy insecurity, game changer for Europe's energy transition, but in what direction? So the discussion unfolds really with what happened in recent months. You may recall that we started the year quite hopeful in regard to making progress on this important issue of global climate change. The European Union had defined its Fit for 55 package, was aiming at reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030, and was trying to aim for climate neutrality by 2050. In the United States, we had a president whose administration is taking decisions based on climate science. And in Germany, we have an energy minister who started the year out with oversized PowerPoint slides that he used to present the climate challenge to the public, aiming at catching up with Germany's energy and climate strategy. All of this also seemed very timely because we had the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, coming up with their latest report. And when it was presented, Jim Ski, the co-chair of Working Group 3 of IPCC, said, "It's now or never if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees." So all of this is less than 5 months ago and marked the beginning of 2022. But then, as you know, things changed quite dramatically on February 24. We had Russia starting a war in Ukraine and the West trying to react to the situation. We saw one round after another of sanctions being imposed on Russia, and of course, energy was a very central part of that theme. There was first a discussion about dependence on Russian coal, then Russian oil, then Russian gas, and all of a sudden, the dependence of our energy supply on one particular country was something that was no longer just a matter of people in the energy industry, people on the panel here today, who were aware of these issues for a very long time, but it really kind of became aware. Many people in the public and many politicians became aware of these challenges. In fact, Josep Borrell, the EU foreign minister, if you like, said 6 weeks into the war, "We have now, since the war started, paid 35 billion euros to Russia for oil and gas imports, and we spent $1 billion for Ukraine for humanitarian aid," which is in clear contradiction to the policy priorities that the European Union had in terms of trying to come to a peaceful solution of this conflict. So governments are now trying to find alternatives to these energy imports. And the question is, what will that do to the situation that I just described? The momentum that was there on moving towards low-carbon solutions, that is really what we have to discuss today. That's being discussed as we speak in the media, in policy circles. So where do we go from here? It's a great honor and pleasure to have 3 panelists here with us today who have a lot to say on this very question. I will briefly introduce them from left to right, looking from your perspective. So next to me here is Ben van Beurden. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Shell. He has been the CEO of Shell since 2019, was a member of... 13? 13, yeah. Thank you. He was a member of the board since 2013, that's correct, right? Thank you. He actually, in fact, joined the company in 1983, so he has quite some experience in this company, has seen many parts of the business, was originally trained in chemical engineering at TU Delft, is a Dutch citizen, and he has recently relocated with the company from the Netherlands to the UK. He just yesterday had the pleasure of announcing the quarterly results of the company. And I'll just pick one quote here from what you said yesterday. You said, "Generating value through strong earnings and cash flow, coupled with maintaining a healthy balance sheet and continuing the disciplined delivery of our strategy are crucial for Shell to play a leading role in the energy transition." Yeah. A statement that has been paraphrased in a similar context a few months ago by a BBC journalist as saying, the oil giant Shell says it needs oil to pay for the green shift. So we'll come back to that in just a bit.
Sure, that's true.
We have next to Ben Kerstin Knapp. She joins us from Denmark. She's the Executive Vice President and Chief Human Resources Officer, or Chief People and Culture Officer, as they say in that company, of Vestas, the largest wind turbine manufacturer in the world. She's a native Austrian, has a Master of Science in Psychology and an MBA from Vienna and Minnesota, a very windy place in the north of America. Interestingly, Kerstin has also spent about a decade of her career in the oil industry before joining Vestas in early 2020. Vestas, for those of you who are not so familiar with the wind industry, is employing 29,000 people and has supplied more than 145 gigawatts of wind turbines. I've failed to find the exact number of converting that into turbines, but at least last year alone, you shipped more than 4,000 wind turbines, which is about 100 times the number of turbines that are being installed in Switzerland altogether. So welcome, Kerstin.
Thank you.
And then on the right of the panel, from further away, is Franklin Chang Diaz, joining us from the United States. Franklin is Costa Rican by origin. He's famous for having been an astronaut, so he has spent time in space for quite a bit. He was on 7 space shuttle missions. I asked him earlier, and that seems to be the highest number of space shuttle missions that anyone has ever done. So that's very remarkable. He's by now the founder and CEO of Ad Astra Rocket Company, and also which also has a subsidiary called Ad Astra Energy and Environmental Services, focusing on hydrogen and renewable energy in Costa Rica. Apart from his fascination for space, he also cares about climate change. For example, when preparing for this panel, I looked at a movie that was done 10 years ago called The Odyssey 2050, where he, among other things, said the important thing is that it is not too late and it's time to act now. That's what you said 10 years ago. So we'll come back to the question of whether now is still the time to act. So a great panel to have for an important and challenging question that we will discuss in terms of where do we go from here in terms of this energy transition in light of the geopolitical events. As my initial question to the 3 panelists, I would like to pick up on something that was being discussed here yesterday. There was a session about climate change yesterday where Florence Tendu-Melik, the CEO of Zurich Insurance for France, sat here and said, "We believe climate change is probably the most existential threat that is currently posed to humanity," which is a quote that sounds a bit like it could come from an environmental organization, but it came from Zurich Insurance Company. And she went on to say, we think that if we don't mitigate climate change, we could face losses of 18% of global of GDP in 2050. 18% GDP loss. For comparison, that's about 5 pandemics, right? So my question to you, and Ben, I'll start out with you. Do you agree with what Florence said, that climate change is the most existential threat? And do you also agree that it's going to lead, if we don't take care of it, to substantial financial losses?
Yes, as a matter of fact, that same quote could also have come from my company. I do believe, and my company believes that climate change is existential, needs to be addressed, and companies like us should play a leading role in it. You trilled the question with me, and I misunderstood you first. If we don't address it, could it significantly impact the global economy? Absolutely, yeah. And I can't judge whether 18% is correct or whether it should be more or less. However, quite often people also say addressing climate change is also going to destroy the economy, and that I definitely do not agree with.
Thank you. So you also see it as an existential threat, and you're reasonably optimistic that if we take action, it's not going to cost us a fortune. Kerstin, how is your view on this?
Yeah, I think, to the first part of the question, whether it is a substantial threat, I think we all agree, and I agree as well. And I think, coming a bit back from what you said, your company should be a company to play a part in that transition and in that mitigation. I think we are working for a company and representing a company which actually does it and really can and are prepared to accelerate that. On the other hand, if the GDP question arises, I haven't heard the comment. I don't know what she's basing her assumptions on, but I think it could be also an opportunity, maybe, on the other hand, which we can pick up, because everything which impacts us negative there's always an opportunity there, and maybe we should look at that and see what can we do in order to avoid that.
Thank you, Kerstin. Franklin, you have the overview. You've been to space. You've watched the planet evolve. So what's your take on this?
Thanks for having me here. Well, let me give you the perspective of an astronaut. Think of the planet as a spacecraft, and in that sense, we're all members of the crew of this spaceship. And to an astronaut, the most important system in the spacecraft is not the engine or the communication system or anything like that. It's a life support system. When the life support system fails, you die. It's as simple as that, right? And this is the only spacecraft we have. We have no choice. We have no alternative, no redundancy. And so, yes, absolutely, this is an existential threat, and it has to be addressed immediately. We cannot wait and debate. So I don't know if it's 18% or whatever, but you die.
An important, well, okay. That's a way of looking at it. If we die, it doesn't matter whether it's 18 or 19%?
Doesn't matter. Yeah.
Thank you. That's very clear. So, given that all of you seem to agree that climate change is so urgent and should be urgently addressed, you could think that the current situation would motivate decision makers all around the world to actually speed up with the energy transition. But then when I opened this morning's Wall Street Journal, I read an article that actually had the headline, Shell's foggy outlook sways investors but not politicians, but that was not the main point here. It basically said that, yes, there is a discussion about the energy transition, but the green transition isn't likely going to shift near-term demand, and some countries seem to be rethinking the pace of the energy transition. So this Wall Street journalist didn't seem convinced that the current situation will lead to an acceleration of the energy transition. If we can't even convince Wall Street Journal journalists, then how can policymakers be convinced?
That's a question for me, I take it, Rolf. Well, I think that is actually the key question. How can we accelerate? I don't think we have to convince young generations. If my children are any sort of standard to go by, and many others that I speak with, everybody understands that we need to go a whole lot faster. Probably also policymakers somewhere deep down there understand that it needs to go faster, but I just don't know how to do it. And for many a time, of course, policymakers think that setting targets is what it's all about. But it's a little bit like the desperate dieter who sets a target to lose 10 kilos in 8 weeks, and 2 weeks then finds out that he has gained 2 kilos. So you set a more ambitious target. But at some point in time, you run out of room to actually deliver on your target. I think that is what we are facing at the moment. I think the pathway to net zero still exists for the world. I think in Europe we have a pretty good pathway. I'm happy to talk about what it would take, but it is still fantastically complicated. And here we get to another problem. I think that many of our policymakers are actually quite energy illiterate. That don't, and it's getting better, but a few years ago I was still astounded to meet very senior establishment people who could not tell the difference between energy and electricity. Or if I would tell, well, electricity is 20% of final energy consumption, they would say 20%? No, I thought it was more like 90, isn't it? So there is really a deep fundamental absence of understanding, and that I think is also holding us back. We can get there. It will take a fantastic amount of policy intervention, but it starts with people understanding actually what the problem is and how to solve it, not setting targets.
Mm-hmm. So educating policymakers would be on your wish list. When I look to Denmark, I always kind of looking from Switzerland, you get the impression that there's a lot of literate policymakers in Denmark because it has been one of the pioneers in wind energy. Would you share that impression, Kerstin? Is it?
I think that's right, but I mean, I think on our challenge to solve the common problem we have, Denmark alone will not do it neither, right? It's part of the European Union, but I think it takes much more. And you referenced the IPCC report, which says that by 2030, if we really want to reduce the green gashouse emissions to the target of 1.5 or even 2%, we need to reduce 45%. And I think, you know, for me, facts are very clear. I think the point is how realistic is it and how can we help accelerate? Because as Ben mentioned, I think there are bottlenecks with regards to regulatory issues, with regards to grid ramp up, many things. But also, I think still education. You know, are we making enough young people and generations aware how to especially avoid using energy as much as, I would say, in my generation, how I grew up, it wasn't really an issue, to be very honest.
Mm-hmm. So education on all levels, not just policymakers, also energy consumers. Do you feel like there's something changing, like in the last 2 months since the war began? Do you see an increase in education or literacy, if you like, or awareness of energy consumers?
Well, yes and no. This is a very difficult statement that I'm going to make now, but if there could be a silver lining to this atrocious conflict in the Ukraine, it is that actually it has opened the eyes of a number of people how dependent we are on energy and where it all is. And okay, we see it now through the European and Russian lens, but I hope that people also begin to understand what a massive system it is and how complicated it would be to really reform it and change it. Now that people say, okay, we have to get out of Russian gas. Okay, how do we do this? Maybe this will bring also an insight how difficult it is to actually wean an entire economy out of all hydrocarbons, which is ultimately what will need to happen. So I do think there is the beginnings of a better understanding. But still, in my mind, even under the crisis that we're currently facing, a lot of the discussion is how do we deal with supply? If we can't get our gas from Russia, where do we get it from? And there's not too many people there to just say, how do we actually change demand? And you know what? People don't use energy because we are insisting on you use our products. It is actually quite the other way around. Yeah? Demand drives supply. And if you do not get a change in demand patterns, it's very, very hard for a company like us to push demand or to push supply, a different sort of supply into the system. So I think there's still not enough of that role. I think governments need to understand that a little bit better, that policies that intervene on the demand side of energy are as important, if not more important, than supply-driven policies.
Now, we're meeting here at the business school, and in the sort of economic context, you would think that demand and supply, that also has something to do with price. So in that sense, the higher energy prices we're currently seeing should have an effect on demand. So is that a good thing? Would you, and some policymakers think it's a bad thing and they need to do something about it? What's your take on this?
Well, you could take a more fundamental sort of microeconomic view and say, well, you know, price goes up, demand goes down, and supply comes on, and alternatives present themselves, etc., etc. That's all true, but it's just not good enough. Everybody, this is one of the things that I dislike the most in some of the discussions we're having on carbon pricing, etc., is people who believe that the market will sort it all out. The market will play a very important role in making the system efficient and finding the best way of dealing with the system, if you like, supply and demand. But it will not generate new demand, or it will not generate new supply fast enough. For that, you do need policy intervention. you do need to have bans, you need to have standards, you need to have mandates, you need to actually have governments orchestrating things, not just say, let's put another $10 on the price of CO2 and then somehow the economy will reform itself. That is sort of 1990s thinking as far as climate change is concerned.
So you actually think government intervention, the things you mentioned, bans, standards, would help to speed up the transition?
Well, take my favorite example, because I think everybody can relate to it in a way. Take aviation. Do we really think that making tickets more expensive is going to somehow change the emissions of the aviation industry? I don't think so. It may suppress demand a little bit. Well, could we then put some sort of carbon price on kerosene and then somehow planes start using different types of products, maybe sustainable biofuels? So we talked about it earlier on as well. Yeah, it could. It would probably take about a carbon price of between $1,000 and $1,500 a ton. And then it would start to make sense to put biofuels into the mix. Who is going to put a $1,500 a ton carbon price on aviation? And how is it going to be done globally? So in the end, how we're going to decarbonize aviation is by mandates, blend mandates. So 5% of jet fuel needs to be bio-based material with a minimum standard of carbon intensity. And then in a few years' time, we drive that up to 10% and 20% and 50%. And the price is then the resultant of it. So companies like ourselves, who would love to invest, and as a matter of fact are investing in bio-based aviation fuels, know that the demand is there because the demand is mandated. At this point in time, I can go to Lufthansa, which we do, and say, please buy my sustainable aviation fuels. It's only $300 a barrel. And they say, well, we'll try that, and we'll try to see whether we can convince our customers to use it. Last time I spoke with the CEO of Lufthansa, he said, I had 22 customers today who are using it. You know, that's not a way to drive change. You have to put mandates in place. Very unpopular with politicians, but nevertheless the only way it will work.
I agree with you that it's not the first thing that politicians like to introduce. However, what's interesting here in Switzerland is that there are 3 cantons who actually, by means of a popular vote, introduced bans on oil heatings. Is that a good idea?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. You know, we tried putting a carbon price of $300 per ton on personal mobility. You may not recognize it, but that is actually the tax that we pay on petrol and diesel in Europe. $300 a ton of CO2. Did that really help drive down car use? No. Did people switch to electric cars because of that? No. They switched to electric cars because they were fun to drive. I have one myself. And it is now happening because governments say, hey, we ban internal combustion engines. That's how you make change, not by putting a price on carbon.
Franklin, do you have an electric car?
I do. I have a fuel cell electric car, not a battery electric car. So there are 2 different types of electric cars.
Is it also fun to drive?
It's a lot of fun to drive. You can step on the gas and it really goes. And I make my own hydrogen. We make our own hydrogen. We make it with water, solar. We have a solar farm, and it is the first fully integrated hydrogen ecosystem in all of Latin America. And we would like to basically spread this whole decarbonization. I was kind of going back to the government needs to get involved. You're absolutely correct. It's not going to happen all by itself. But, you know, we are in a crisis, and they say that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And so I think we should take advantage of the fact that the world is in a crisis. And I don't worry so much. I mean, I do worry about, you know, climate change. You know, people talk about climate change. It sounds, climate sounds a little bit, it's going to be a little warmer, maybe a little cooler change. Or global warming. It's really global heating. I mean, it's heating to the point that the ice caps on both the North and the South Pole are melting. I mean, this is serious stuff. You know, I keep talking about the urgency of things, but recently there was a notice on social media that the two ice caps on North and South Pole were melting at an unbelievably fast rate. It was a footnote in the social media. The social media was dominated by Will Smith, hitting the guy who insulted, I guess, in the Oscars. And this is what people are worried about and concerned about. So, something needs to change.
Yeah. So climate change is very urgent, as you illustrate also with these examples of the melting ice caps. Also these days, when we look to India, this has had a record heat wave, temperatures of 50 degrees in some of the cities in spring, which is really unprecedented. So Kerstin, that should be great news for a company that's offering the solution. And yet, if we look at your recent announcements a few days ago, it seems like financially you seem to have trouble with the current situation. You don't seem to at least live up to some of these very high expectations that seem to be reflected in investors' share price right after the beginning of this crisis. So what's wrong? Why doesn't this translate into opportunity for a company that offers the solution?
Yeah, it sounds like a really good question to ask, right? Because it seems kind of very obvious that we would have the solution, and I think we have. But I think also building on what Ben said, I think it's not just an industrial acceleration we need, it's a policy acceleration. And I think that's obviously not all the answer to your question, but I think for sure a big one, because I think what really doesn't allow us to help build up a solution quickly is a permitting process, which usually takes between 2 or 10 years. So if you now have a really good idea and you want to invest in a wind park and you're trying to create a permit and it takes you 10 years, then we are definitely beyond 2030. And then you still have to erect and to produce and so on and so forth. So I think that is a real big issue. I think the other one is permitting and grid, let's say, ramp up. We can either replace the energy type in order to use the current grids, or we have to expand the grids. And if you need to expand grids, again, that takes a lot of time in order to help us, accelerate the transition. And then I think, what you actually talked about financial results and how does it challenge us as a company and entire industry, by the way. I think we are still lucky that we are in a good territory compared to our competitors. But I think the challenge we all have in the industry is that you're kind of in the middle, because you have customers who want the cheapest price, pretty much, but the best technology. But then on the other hand, we also depend on raw materials. So you have bottlenecks coming through COVID, coming through the war. You have materials which are needed for other industries. We need a lot of steel to produce our products. Just steel prices raised, I think, in the last, I don't know, maybe it's 1.5 years, 300%. In the last quarter, it was 45%. So it's really, you're squeezed. And I think that is really what we are trying to make everybody recognize. We need also to help the industry to have a chance to go through that successfully. Because yes, we do have the solution and we are ready for that. But we need help from politics, from governments, and from policymakers to help that. But also, as you said, from a flexible supply and demand situation.
And the help could take, for example, the form of faster permitting processes, or what kind of help are you referring to?
What help in faster permitting process?
In terms of government help that you would like to see, how would you like the government to help you?
To speed up the process, to make it less bureaucratic, simply.
Can I comment on that? Because I think Kerstin is absolutely right. But just to, you made a point about, do we want to change the system or expand the system? Let me just share a few statistics from our scenarios, and this is for Europe, but actually it applies to the entire world. So as I said earlier on, we have about 20% of energy demand consumed as electricity at the moment. The other 80% we consume as fossil fuels, whether you like it or not, home heating et cetera, and cars, mobility, planes, ships, and whatever have you.
Also the heating on the terrace here.
Yes, I saw that. It's LPG bottles. So if we want to get to net zero, there is absolutely no way that we can do that without massive electrification of the economy. Yeah. So that means that we have to go from 20% to at least 60% electrification. And that is in an economy that will grow. So that means that on a worldwide basis, we probably need to build an electricity system that's 4 times as big as the current one. Now, the current one took us 150 years to build. Yeah? Now, we need to build another 3 ones, or maybe 4 ones on top of it, in the next 3 decades. So how do you think we're going to do that with permitting systems that are from the last century? Yeah, so that's never going to work. So and only the moment people wake up to that idea and start to really tackle this as a challenge, like an existential threat, and start to put in place sort of like almost a war response to it, are we going to have a chance of success? If at this point in time it's just a matter of, well, you know, we need to have a new substation here and there to put an electric charger in, or, oh, we need to have a connection to the grid from this wind farm, etc. You know, these are not the challenges per se. The challenges are 2 orders of magnitude bigger. And politicians have not quite responded to that challenge.
Well, you say almost a war response. I mean, it is a war response at this point.
Yeah.
Quite literally.
And maybe to even add some more statistics, because to make it even more drastic, but if you look at the requirements to get us to 2030 with our ambitions, you would have to ramp up wind by 4 times, solar by 5 times, and in the same time to reduce fossil fuels by 23%, roughly. So just imagine 4 times from now, and 2030, what always strikes me, that's in 8.5 years, or 7.5 years, sorry, because we're already mid 2022. It's not that much time.
Yeah. You being responsible for human resources or people and culture, as you call it, and investors, that would basically mean you have to recruit a lot of people, no?
Yes. Well, I have another few facts which are actually just stunning. I mean, I just looked a little bit. I mean, in general, I think we're always talking about the shortage of people also in the industry, in the renewable industry. And there are some really amazing facts which have been put together. For instance, if you just look at the UK offshore plans by 2030, the UK will need alone 69,000 people. But it gets better. So if you look at Australia, it's a little bit larger probably. In order to just realize the renewable energy potential of Australia, you require an extra 250,000 people. I'll give you another one. Wind Europe estimates that employees in the wind sector will have to rise by 50% by 2030. And then the Global Wind Energy Council predicts that meeting more ambitious build-out targets will create 3.3 million additional jobs globally and cross the entire value chain by 2030. In the next 5 years, sorry. So, I mean, if you just look at those amazing numbers, the question is, where will we get all these employees from? Because I'm sure, Ben, you're not willing to give them up and let them come over to us. But I'm seriously, and I think the other thing is that we also have then equity targets to meet. So where do we get all the women from? Yep. And so on and so forth. So I think it's a real demand question also.
But that's, I mean, I grew up in Germany where creating jobs was not necessarily seen as something that's bad. Quite the contrary.
That's true.
The country had unemployment and sort of addressing this could also a way of addressing unemployment. Would you agree that that's an opportunity?
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. I was going to respond also to a comment on gender equity, etc. I think that's actually the solution in a way. Yeah. So at this point in time, we recruit in certain quarters more females than males, graduates, in technical jobs. Yeah? So and we are now at a point that we are across the company at 30% female representation, including at all senior management levels. And of course, there's no reason why that wouldn't go to 50%. And you can almost turn it around and say, well, if we don't do that, we're not going to have enough people. The female talent pool is massively underutilized at this point in time.
And are you finding those people?
We do. I think this sort of contrary to somewhat popular belief here and there, we are a very popular company to work for. Also in Europe, for that matter. And I admit sometimes people come to us and say, well, I don't like the industry, but seems to be a good company to sort of learn a few years of generic skills. And then quite often people don't leave because they realize that actually if you really want to make a difference in the energy transition, go work for a company like us. So we don't have issues with attracting and definitely not with retaining people. No.
I had the opportunity to talk to one of your many employees a few months ago. And that was around the time when there was this court case in the Netherlands about climate change, the court asking you to adopt tougher climate targets. And that employee mentioned that a couple of the co-workers were, shall I say, uncertain because it felt unusual to work for a company that was so publicly criticized by a court. You then decided to appeal against that court decision, but did you have similar feedback from other parts of the company that people felt unsure, felt uncomfortable?
Oh, absolutely. And that is still a debate that is going on in the company. And of course, there's many people who say, well, no, why do we appeal? Why not just accept it? In many aspects, we have accepted. So we had, for those of you who are not too familiar with the case, so there was a demand by Milieudefensie, Friends of the Earth, for us to reduce our emissions. And the judge said, well, yeah, you have to reduce your emissions by 45% by 2030. Our own emissions, the emissions that we emit from our refineries and chemical plants and drilling rigs and everything else. And you have an obligation to work on reducing the emissions of your customers by 45%. So we scratched our head a little bit and said, well, 45% reduction of our own emissions. We do about 80 million tons of emissions in 2016. Can we halve that? Yeah, we can. And so basically I said, okay, I'll step up to that challenge. We'll take that. We are going to reduce the emissions of the company by 50% by 2030. And we are well on track. We have done 18% by now, and I have no doubt that we will get to 50% reduction by 2030. But then the 45% reduction for our customers, that's a different matter. Because we have to do it in 10 years, yeah? But now, two benchmarks. So the EU, Fit for 55, in our sector, so which is predominantly mobility and heating and industry, in our sector, the EU has committed to doing 22% over 40 years. And we are being asked to do twice as much in a quarter of the time, and not just in Europe, no, the whole world. I think that's not credible. Mm-hmm. Yeah? If you then ask the IEA net zero emission scenario, maybe some of you are familiar with that, which is a very ambitious scenario. Yeah? We are 1 year into that scenario, and we are already 2.5 years behind. Yeah? So it's very ambitious. But also that, the total emission reduction in the IEA scenario for the whole world, and the net zero scenario, is 20% for the next decade. So why on earth do we think that we can do 2.5 times as much?
Maybe because IPCC says that's what it takes to get to 1.5 degrees.
But that's for the global economy, yeah, and that is taking coal-fired power generation into account. I wish I was in coal-fired power generation these days because I can shut it all down and make a lot of progress. But if you're not, if you are serving airlines and ships and people in homes and people with cars, it's a whole lot tougher to actually just say, why don't I just halve it?
So you say you're doing it where you have control. You say you have less control over your customers, and that's what makes it difficult. That's why you appeal.
Yeah, and I think there's a precedent there. If you don't appeal, you will have a court case every 2 weeks with somebody who will then say, well, you made this wrong decision, and now you're personally liable, and this, that, and the other thing. You cannot tolerate, in my mind, to be saddled with unrealistic and not credible obligations as the only one player in a system problem. And that, I think, is where we need to appeal, basically also almost as a societal duty.
The court or the judge also mentioned the Danish example in their decision, the company called Ørsted, which used to be the Danish oil and natural gas company, which decided quite radically to reinvent themselves as an offshore wind company. Kirsten, you may be familiar with them since they're in Denmark. So why can Ørsted do what Shell sees as too much of a challenge in a way?
Well, I have to say, I might have to pass that question on maybe back to you, because I do know Ørsted, but I don't have the background to answer that question.
So Ben, why is
probably a fair manner.
Well, I think Dong at the time was an upstream company, so it delivered oil and gas into a commodity market, and it decided to go into a different commodity. It decided to deliver commoditized merchant electricity in the power market, and they've been very successful. But that is not necessarily our business model. Most of our Scope 3 emissions, the emissions of our customers, do not come from our upstream. Our upstream is actually only a fraction of the Scope 3 emissions. Most of our emissions come from retailing petrol and retailing diesel and retailing kerosene and selling LPG bottles to the patio heater here and these types of things. That is a business that Dong wasn't in, yeah? And therefore, it's not just a matter of saying, you know what, I won't have this drilling rig anymore, I will put a wind farm in its place. We have to say, you know what, these 30 million customers that come every day, why don't we have different customers? And you can't do that. The only way you can, at the pace that was being asked for shed with these emissions, is to actually get rid of your customers. Which is not a good business model, I can tell you, in case you hadn't figured that out. But the other thing is, you know, another example, back to my aviation story. We are the largest aviation player in the world. We have 8% market share. We operate at 1,000 airports.
I get that aviation is challenging. Can we take a simpler customer as an example?
Go for it.
St. Gallen Symposium, you mentioned the gas heating here on the patio. Maybe you would still have St. Gallen Symposium as a customer, even if you would encourage them to change their heating system.
And that's exactly what, indeed, we advocate for and what we are doing. And of course, we are making a lot of progress in different supply chains. But in the end, you need to have your customer. Give me maybe also a link back to Franklin, hydrogen. Yeah? We are also a leading player in hydrogen. The only problem with hydrogen is it's tiny. But we're okay from our still leading position to really grow this business really fast. And I'm about to take an investment decision on a very large-scale electrolyzer. We already have the largest in the world in China, and a very large one in Germany as well. But we're going to scale it up at a factor 10, a $1 billion investment in the Netherlands for a green hydrogen plant with 0 customers. There's no customer for that plant yet. Our investors don't like that idea necessarily, for obvious reasons, but I think this is what it takes, because hydrogen is a chicken and egg problem. Yeah? So at some point in time, somebody will have to move, and we have the confidence to move. But therefore, this market needs to be generated. And I'm fine to work with Brussels, with The Hague, with London, with whoever, to help us generate this market and these customers. But it won't happen overnight. We will not all of a sudden have thousands and thousands of hydrogen trucks on the road because I happen to build a hydrogen plant for them. It is actually quite a difficult puzzle to solve. And again, go back to the coordination piece, where everybody has to work together, and governments have to play their role in orchestrating it all.
What's your take on hydrogen, Kirsten?
So I think I'll start with the conclusion first, but I think, green hydrogen is definitely playing or will play a part in the transition, but rather towards 2050. And I think that's a little bit the problem. First of all, I think if you convert one, let's say, energy resource in another energy resource, you have losses. So it's not very efficient right now. And I think the build out and everything is taking too long in order to address the real current imminent challenges we are having. So direct electrification through solar and through wind is definitely the best and the first step we should take.
Frankly, can we, in that regard, direct electrification and the high share of solar and wind, can we learn something from Costa Rica? I read that Costa Rica has more than 98% of its electricity coming from renewables.
Yeah, Costa Ricans pride themselves on being very green. And yes, the grid is 99% renewable, clean, but as Ben pointed out, it's 25% of the total energy consumption. The other 75% is hydrocarbons. So, we do have a problem, even though it is green. But in Costa Rica, it's a very attractive situation because a gallon of gasoline costs, over $5. And we are making hydrogen at roughly $7 a kilogram. We're selling it at $12 a kilogram. And, 1 kilo of hydrogen in my car, it drives me 120 kilometers. So it's like 2 gallons of gasoline. So, it begins to get close.
Yeah.
And our system is small. It is a chicken and egg. You're correct. And yeah, you could, get a big chicken, which is cheaper per pound, okay, but no egg. So you make a big bet. We have chosen to just have a lot of little chickens, but with the eggs. So we build a lot of them and
more like a decentralized approach.
That's right. And another thing that comes to me, when we talk about energy, is that energy really is already distributed. Our model for energy, for many years has been centralized, where you make energy at one point, and then you spread it out, sell it, through a grid. But you can easily now consider, because of renewables, that you can make little micro grids and make them all connect, especially in places like Africa or places in Latin America where the infrastructure doesn't exist, and there is an opportunity to make the jump directly into the distributed system.
Yes.
And as far as efficiency, that issue has come up a lot in hydrogen for us. And efficiency, yes, it is a lot more efficient to put electricity into a battery, but it takes longer and it's heavier. So, sometimes efficiency is not the only metric that you want to look at, given that the energy that comes from the sun is free, right? And if you don't use it, you're gonna waste it anyway. So convenience is important.
Yes.
Not just efficiency.
Ben, you also seem to have done a number of investments that are kind of, shall I say, betting on direct electrification. You acquired Sonnen, the battery maker, Next Kraftwerke, Ubitricity, so you seem to see a potential there as well.
Oh no, absolutely. Electricity is a core part of our strategy. We do not believe we can win as a company over the next 50, 100 years without being a major player in electricity as well. That's why we are a good customer of Vestas. But
we appreciate that.
But again, it needs to be embedded in the system. Yeah? If we want to be a hydrogen player, we have to have an integrated position where we can source that hydrogen from green power. And where we can use it in our road transportation markets that we currently have a strong position in as well. But also households. If you sell gas to a household and you want to still have that household as a customer going forward, maybe St. Gallen as well, we will have to sell electricity. And we will have to do that in a value proposition that actually makes sense, that is better than what your old and tired utility can offer you. We have to have a more dynamic way of dealing with our customers. So for us, it's absolutely key. But to the efficiency point, that's why I put up my hand. You're absolutely right. It is making a round-trip electricity into hydrogen and back into electricity is less efficient. But 2 points. If you have no alternative, like on a ship or in a plane or in industry, it is actually, efficiency doesn't matter, a bit Franklin's point. And the other thing, can I remind you again, that the least efficient energy converter was the internal combustion engine, which didn't withhold it from being incredibly successful. But the first cars were totally hopeless, and the current cars are not much better in terms of energy efficiency, and still they succeeded.
They succeeded, but they created a bit of a problem along the way with climate change.
Yes, yeah. Not an efficiency problem. No.
Thank you. We could probably go on for another hour here, but we also want to give a few of you the chance to also interact. So there's 2 microphones in the room, and there's already a number of hands up. Where is the microphone on this side? Maybe we can start here in the middle with the gentleman. And if I could invite you to ask a quick and concise question.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. End it here from the leaders of tomorrow, and I will allow myself to be a bit provocative, not too much though. Okay, so I've heard during these days a lot of startups saying that the big companies are not responsive. Now I hear that big companies are saying that the policymakers are slow. Now there is a risk of collaboration, which is a bit of a perception of lack of ownership, but there is a big advantage of shared ownership. When will we start to have this shared ownership rather than just saying that the others are not ready? Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to take that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. Your question is not at all provocative. We need to indeed have shared ownership, and that also means personal responsibility for people like me. It's one thing to say, well, policymakers don't get it. Well, I can't hide behind that, can I? Yeah? Or I cannot just say that's not my problem. It is my problem, because every time policymakers fail, fingers are being pointed at us. And as a matter of fact, I've discovered in the 10 years that I've been sort of really senior roles in Shell, is if we don't intervene, if we don't participate in it, if we don't bring the solutions, if we don't have a constructive attitude to everything, nothing is going to change. So the onus is back on us. If we talk about incompetence or things not moving fast enough, we have to intervene. We cannot lean back and say, if you have it all sorted out, we'll be there for you. It has to be the other way around.
Kerstin?
Can I just add one thing? And maybe I completely agree as well. I think there's a huge question of ownership, but maybe it's not even just shared ownership, maybe it's personal ownership.
Yeah.
Because I think when we all feel personally that we have a problem, we will all do something. Because as we also try to allude to, it's not just that, it's also how do we use energy, how can we be more efficient. It's a system of everything, and because of the urgency, we need to start moving on every part.
Personal responsibility is definitely an important topic. There was another question here.
So I appreciate your time. It's Rani from Indonesia. I think I'm the only Indonesian in the room with representing 270 million populations. We have a lot of talents. So what's your suggestions for us, like developing countries, to prepare so we can supply your talents, and then how we can actually help you with the talents that we have, like immense number of people in Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. Kerstin?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. I always love these kind of questions because my arms are wide open and Wester's arms are wide open. I think the biggest thing is mobility, to be very honest with you. There is no limitations as long as everybody is mobile. The biggest constraint on people is usually their own mobility, and then there's nothing we can do about. But let me just make it very short. There is nothing else, and please reach out. I mean, we will be more than happy to guide you and help you through the system.
Yeah.
And I'm sure the same is true for Shell.
No, that's right. I think Indonesia, of course, is first of all, a wonderful country, but also has 2 fantastic resources. First of all, the natural resource that we need to explore and exploit in a positive way. Nature-based solutions are going to be part of the way forward for the planet, and there's a lot of it, of course, and also a lot to protect in Indonesia. And secondly, the number of people is staggering. So we have to tap into these resources, absolutely.
A question here in the front.
Hi, my question is that the theme of the symposium is all about collaborative advantage. However, as a leader of tomorrow, as a young person concerned about the climate crisis, our future is frankly has been stolen from us in many regards. And for me, I find it difficult to sort of trust those within the fossil fuel industry moving towards electrification because they have harmed so many communities to begin with. Communities of color, indigenous communities have sort of pushed back against the movement that young people are doing today. So sort of where does the accountability come in that aspect, and how do we reconcile the harm and the damage that corporations like Shell and fossil fuel industries have done as a whole?
I take it that's for me.
Yes.
But well, first of all, I want to acknowledge what you say. There's no way I can push back on that and say, no, that's actually not true. I think our industry, sometimes with an element of disregard, indeed, has done things that need to be made amends for. I think many in our industry, by the way, have also recognized that and have internalized it, and have significantly changed the way they operate. And I'm very clear for the upstream part of the company, which is, of course, a shrinking part of the company. We need to be the most responsible player going forward. And then still we have to deal with, be it communities of color at fence lines of our facilities, or whether it is communities in the extractive regions of the world, where we have to figure out how to bring back or make good the damage that has been done. There is no contest there. But it doesn't make it an easier challenge. But a little bit to your other point, lack of trust, I can understand that. I fully understand that. But on the other hand, I would also like to make another plea, which is the scale of this transformation, which we haven't even put detailed numbers on, that is going to be required, can only be done by large system players. And so if I needed to build my hydrogen business with the income from the hydrogen business, it will take me 100 years to get anywhere. But if I can say, well, I can put the whole financial resource of the company into those parts of the system that are going to be free cash flow negative for maybe 2 decades to come, I can go really fast. So in many places where we do invest, we are often the largest investor in the energy transition. That doesn't make these businesses highly profitable, no, but they are being funded by the traditional businesses, a bit to the point that you made earlier, Rolf. And I know that is a difficult narrative, and people say, no, I wouldn't like Shell doing this. Can't we have a startup do it? Well, you can, but then we're not going to get anywhere to net zero in 2050.
Is there maybe something in between an oil company and a startup, such as a wind turbine manufacturer? And Kerstin,
I could
actually, what I
agree
wanted
to that.
what I actually wanted to ask you, Kerstin, is I mean, you've worked in both the oil and renewables industry. Do you feel there's a difference in the amount of trust that you enjoy in this industry that you're working in right now?
So I have to be careful now, because I have to say in my breast there are 2 hearts, and I have enjoyed for a long time to work in your industry, and I have been fascinated by it. But I do have to say that there is a difference, and I think the main difference for me is in the core purpose. And I think if you look at Vestas, I think it's clear that our purpose is to help the green transition, to help to get to a better place. And I don't have to explain it necessarily too far. But I also want to recognize the oil companies, because I think they've also done a lot for communities. And I've worked across sectors, and I have to say there's a lot of investments also going from oil companies into how to sustain communities and how to work with them in order to mitigate the issues you are mentioning. But I think to round it up, I think it takes all of us, and that is, I think, also a little bit your message. It's not, we're not going to win pointing here and there. I think we all have to recognize the situation is serious, and we have to see what is the best short-term and mid-term solution in order to reach our targets and to create a better world for tomorrow. And if I can say one more thing, I would like to thank the young lady for her comments. But I also think it's like, whenever we talk about problems, we can have a choice of looking at the glass half full and half empty. And I think we all are here to make a difference. So why don't we look at the opportunity, and why don't we try everything we can to make it better?
Yeah.
Hashtag collaborative advantage.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. that sounded like a final word, and I think looking at the time, it might have been the final word. So I would like to thank the three panelists again for this very open-minded discussion on a very important topic. Hopefully this is not going to be the last time that we kind of discuss these issues, both here on the panel, but also for all of you. As we heard, climate change is a really serious issue. This whole energy transition has been put to even more importance now through the geopolitical situation. So as we heard, it's not just some companies who can address this. We need all of us to work on this. So I would also like to thank the organizers for putting this important topic here on the agenda. It is so timely. You couldn't probably have foreseen that when you first conceived of the program, but I'm sure it was definitely worthwhile to have that discussion. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of the symposium.